Welcome to Chapter 2 of the Louisiana Manual for the Environmental Horticulture Industry. I pray that this recording helps you to pass your test. Chapter 2, Plant Growth and Development. Structure and Function. The structure and function of the various plant parts determine how they grow. The major plant parts include roots, stems, leaves, and protective parts. There's a great variation in appearance of these plant parts found throughout the plant kingdom. However, their basic functions generally remain the same. See Figure 1 on the first page of Chapter 2. There's the leaf, the internode, the stem, the node, the roots, the flower, the fruit, the seeds, and the axillary bud. Roots. The functions of the root system are absorption, anchorage, conduction, and storage. In a normal healthy plant, there's a balance between the shoot system and the root system. This balance may be disturbed by root loss during transplanting, or through improper cultivation. The balance can be restored by pruning some of the top, the shoot growth of the plant. If not done, the plant may die because the roots are unable to supply the tops with adequate moisture and nutrients. Root loss during transplanting is much greater in bare root and bald and burlap trees and shrubs than in container plants. Root loss may also occur because of construction around existing plants, poor drainage, and diseases such as root rot. Two kinds of root systems are found in plants: fibrous and taproot systems. The fibrous root system consists of numerous multi-branched roots that are slender and fiber-like. No one root is more prominent than the others. Many nursery plants have this type of root system. The taproot consists of one main root that grows directly downward from which branch roots arise. The main root may be a fleshy, food-storing organ, carrot, or a woody root, oak or maple. Those are great examples. The tap roots generally penetrate much deeper in the soil than fibrous roots. Thus, plants with a tap root are more difficult to transplant. Large amounts of water are absorbed through millions of thin-walled root hairs. Each root hair is formed from a single epidermal cell near the growing tip of the root. Each one lasts only a short time, and many are killed during transplanting. Plants wilt when water loss is greater than water intake. Because little water absorption occurs through the epidermis, which is the outer cell layer, or through older roots, where root hairs are no longer present, special care must be given during transplanting. Roots should not be exposed longer than absolutely necessary. In the nursery, they should be heeled in with moist mulch or sod until transplanted. The customer should be told about the effects of allowing the roots to dry out when purchasing bare root plants. See Figure 2, Growing Tip of the Root, on page 9. A few plants do not have root hairs. These plants are often found growing in humus-type soils where microorganisms and beneficial fungi are present. Specialized fungi seem to help them absorb water. Anchorage is gained by the extensiveness of the root system through both spread and depth. Plants are more resistant to being blown over by the wind and are less susceptible to damage by cultivation when soil conditions allow roots to penetrate down into the soil. Plants that have become root-bound within their containers need special attention. The roots should be spread out or pruned if they are coiled around themselves to encourage the root system to grow outward into the surrounding soil. Plant nutrients must be in a soluble form so they can easily pass through the root cell walls and be carried to the leaves for manufacture into plant food. Any plant receiving fertilizer should be well watered so that the fertilizer is diluted throughout the root zone. An excess of fertilizer can result in root damage and burning or browning of the foliage. This is a result of water shortage in the foliage because water is pulled or drawn out of the plant root when the surrounding nutrient solutions contain too high a concentration of fertilizer. Stems. The primary functions of the stem are to support conduction and storage. The stem holds the leaves up so they can receive more light, which is important in the manufacturing of plant food. Some woody plants have a single stem, often called a trunk, with various methods of branching. Others have many stems arising from the crown. The interior, dense, heartwood of each older stem is dead and serves only for support. Conduction is the movement of water, mineral solutions, and substances manufactured in the plant. Water and mineral solution move upward from the roots to the leaves throughout inner tissues called the xylem. Manufactured food from the leaves moves out of the leaves through the outer stem tissues called phloem. These two tissues form the vascular system of the plant. The tissue between the xylem and the phloem is called the cambium layer, which forms new xylem and phloem. Plant function and growth depends on uninterrupted conduction. Not all plants have the same arrangement of xylem, phloem, and cambium. In monocotyledonous plants with a single seed leaf, the xylem and phloem tissues are formed in bundles, scattered in discontinuous vascular system throughout the stem. Corn, grass, lilies, and orchids are all examples of monocots. And that's this monocotyledon plant. If you look at figure 3 on page 11, it shows you what monocots are. So an example of a monocot is corn, and an example of a dicot is a sunflower. In dicotyledonous plants with 2 seed leaves, and gymnosperms, these are many seed leaves. The xylem is formed on the inside, next to the heartwood, surrounded by a continuous layer of cambium, with the phloem on the outside. As an example, most trees, shrubs, annuals, and perennials are like this. The cambium forms new xylem on the inside of an annual ring or cycle of growth, and new layers of phloem are formed on the outside of the cambium layer. The older layers of phloem form the bark on trees and shrubs. The monocots do not have vascular cambium and therefore do not expand in girth after the original cells have expanded. The gymnosperms and dicots have vascular cambium growth in both height and diameter. It is important to prevent damage to the cambium layer and the vascular tissues. This could be caused by wire too tightly tied to stake up a plant, or plastic rope used to ball up a plant's roots, or by weed trimmers making bruises and cuts. The first 2 conditions, which would be when wire is tied too tightly or plastic rope used to ball up plants' roots, those 2 conditions can kill a plant if left unchecked. And the third, which is when weed trimmers hit it, the third can be an open invitation for insects and plant diseases. It may also predispose a plant to winter injury. A girdle is a complete circle of dead tissue around the stem, which interrupts the food supply pipeline. When a stem is completely girdled, the phloem cells below the girdle no longer receive food from the leaves. Therefore, all leafless parts below the girdle will be starved. The areas on stems where leaves emerge are called nodes, and the spaces between are called internodes. In the angle where each leaf joins the stem, there's an axillary bud, which is compressed, dormant. It's a compressed and dormant stem. The angle is called the axil of the leaf. Specialized stems and roots. Some plants have modified stem and root structures that store exponentially large amounts of food and function as asexual reproductive structures. That means the plant can reproduce itself. Some of the growth patterns in modified stems are quite complex and involve changes from vegetative growth to reproductive development and back again. These growth cycles are usually controlled by changes in temperature, although moisture may be the controlling factor for tropical plants. Bulbs and corms are examples of modified stems that function in this way. Some of the most popular horticulture plants are propagated by bulbs, corms, rhizomes, tubers, and tuberous roots. Lilies, tulips, hyacinths, narcissus, Dutch iris, and other early spring flowers develop from bulbs. Crocus, colchicum, and gladiolus all have corms. Most irises, cannas, gingers, and orchids send up leaves and flower stalks from rhizomes. In addition, grass can also reproduce from sprigs or stolons. Strawberry plants are obtained from the ends of stolons. Potatoes and caladiums are propagated from tubers. Corms, rhizomes, and tubers are all modified stems. Bulbs are composed of a compressed stem and modified fleshy leaves. The structure of each of these is slightly different, but all except tuberous roots have nodes comparable to those on a typical stem. Buds form at these nodes. A true bud, such as a daffodil, consists primarily of fresh fleshy, modified leaves containing stored food. Its stem, or basal plate, is very compressed. For example, the hard part of an onion, cut off in food preparation for cooking, is the basal plate. Each scale leaf develops from a node on this plate. However, a new growing point appears in the axil of about every fourth leaf. These growing points begin to develop in the fall and continue growing during spring, while the old mother bulb is flowering. In some cases, the mother bulb gradually disintegrates after flowering as the scales of the new bulb enlarge and develop. Figure 4 shows underground plant parts. In order to have successful flowering the next year, green foliage must be maintained as long as possible to provide a source of carbohydrates to be stored in the new bulb. A relatively cool growing season following bloom is needed by most spring flowering bulbs, but not what we can ordinarily expect in the South. This helps explain why commercial production of spring bulbs and related structures is difficult in our area. It's helpful to feed and water bulbs during and after flowering to help maintain vegetative growth as long as possible. The period of relatively warm weather is necessary to initiate changes from vegetative growth to reproductive development within a spring flowering bulb. However, blooms will not be produced until it is exposed to temperatures around 40 degrees for about 8 to 12 weeks, which occurs during winter for fall planted bulbs. Following this, bloom stalks will develop when warm temperatures again prevail. As already mentioned, the changes in some cases are also controlled by differences in moisture. This is typical of species that have developed in tropical areas where seasons are wet-dry rather than hot-cold. The large flowered Dutch amaryllis is an example of a plant that goes dormant in response to dry conditions. Corms, such as gladiolus, differ from bulbs in that they are solid stem structures with remains of dried scale leaves surrounding and protecting them. Nodes can be seen if these dried leaves are removed. Again, the cycle of changes is controlled by the temperature. During the time the mother corm is flowering, a new corm is developing at its top. By fall, there's only a small shriveled remnant of the original corm. Maintenance of foliage following flowering is important. A rhizome, such as Louisiana iris, is essentially the main axis or stem of the plant in a horizontal position underground. Its development is not as complicated as that of bulbs and corms. Leaves and bloom stalks arise either from the growing apex or from nodes farther back. Following bloom, this entire section of the structure disintegrates, but others have been developing to take its place. There is little difference between rhizomes and stylons. Cylindrical, horizontal stems, called rhizomes, are normally found below the soil surface. They are called stolons if above the ground. So rhizomes are below the soil, stolons are above the soil. These specialized stem structures can be divided, so the pieces contain bulbs that will develop into new shoots. Tuberous roots do not have nodes and buds. Sometimes shoots will develop if the storage roots are subjected to proper conditions. Sweet potatoes, tuberous roots, exposed to high temperatures, will produce shoots. In many plants, shoots are not produced unless a portion of the crown, which is the area where stem and root tissue meet, is included with the root. This propagation method is referred to as crown division. Dahlia is an example of a plant that must be propagated in this way. Stored food in the root is used in the development of new shoots. During the growing season, new storage roots are formed at the base of the new shoot as the old ones gradually disintegrate. What we have then is a biennial root living through 2 growing seasons and an annual top living through 1 growing season. It should be noted that fibrous plant roots behave somewhat differently, but often can be used for root cutting, which will develop shoots. Shoot production occurs readily in many species. It's easy to root plants that sucker or, for example, send up shoots from the roots. Because there is a wide variation of the basic patterns of development among plant species, it's important to learn as much as possible about each plant with which you work. Questions frequently arise about forcing spring flowering bulbs to bloom indoors. Temperature control is very difficult in the average home, and results are rarely successful. Most florists buy preconditioned bulbs prepared by specialists using precise temperature regimens required for each species. Only then can blooming be expected to compare with that found in a plant growing in its native habitat. Outdoor planting of spring bulbs can be done from October until December. Results with these are quite satisfactory in most areas of Louisiana. Tulips and hyacinths must be refrigerated for at least 6 weeks and are planted in late December to early January. Most spring bulbs are best treated as annuals. Lily bulbs are more perishable than are those of tulip, hyacinth, and narcissus, and must be handled more carefully. They should not be allowed to become dry. So tulips, hyacinths, and narcissus should not be allowed to become dry. They're highly subject to fungus and virus diseases, making them hard to maintain in the warm, humid Gulf region. All underground storage structures are very susceptible to fungus and other soil-borne diseases. It's important to plant them in well-drained, sunny locations. In heavy clay soil, do not plant as deep as is recommended for sandy or organic soils. Sales of spring flowering bulbs in the fall contribute greatly to the dollar volume at that time. It is helpful and important to know something of their growth habits and their requirements. Page 16 and the top of page 17 will talk to you about spring flowering. Plant in the soil in the fall. Page 17, leaves. The most conspicuous organs of plants are their leaves. Leaves vary in arrangement on the stem, form, vein distribution, which is called venation, and structure, in addition to many other characteristics. Leaf characteristics are used extensively in the description of a species. However, reliance cannot be placed on characteristics alone, since their appearance is easily changed by environmental conditions. Generally, leaves of dicots vary from the leaves of monocots. A typical leaf of a dicot generally has netted venation, one of the more prominent veins with branches forming a conspicuous net, while monocots have parallel veined leaves with inconspicuous branching between the veins. It's just like corn. So corn is like this. Leaves have two main functions to carry out: photosynthesis and transpiration. The leaves of most plants are the chief food manufacturing organs through the process called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis may be briefly defined as the process whereby carbon dioxide and water, carbon dioxide being CO2 and water being H2O, are eventually transformed into sugars, which is glucose, by the living cell using energy from visible light absorbed by chlorophyll, which is the green pigments. During the daylight hours, this process of food manufacturing, or photosynthesis, results in oxygen being given off by the plants. It is through transpiration that the leaf gives off water into the atmosphere. The water balance of a plant is determined by the relative rates of absorption through the roots and transpiration from the leaves. If transpiration is more rapid than absorption, a water deficit occurs within the plant and wilting may result. Figure 5. A leaf cross section showing transpiration through the stomata. The veins, which form a network throughout the leaves, are part of the vascular system previously described. Water movement from the roots through the stem to the leaves depends on lower water pressure at the top of the plant. This pressure difference occurs as a result of transpiration. In addition to providing the mechanisms for water movement through the plant, transpiration serves another purpose. During evaporation of the water from the leaf, leaf temperatures are reduced, thereby helping to prevent injury from excessive heat buildup. Flowers and cones, page 18. Most horticultural plants produce seeds. This characteristic puts them in the most highly developed group of the plant kingdom. This group is subdivided into two groups: angiosperms, plants that bloom and develop fruit, which enclose the seed, and gymnosperms. These are plants that have no true flowers or fruit, but they bear their seeds uncovered in cones or similar structures, such as conifers. Flowers come in many sizes, shapes, and colors. Some are conspicuous, while others are inconspicuous. People often do not realize that grass blooms. Flowers are borne on an enlarged portion of the stem called the receptacle. Their principal value to the retail nurseryman and customer is ornamental. Flowers are also used extensively in the description of a species. The flower may be thought of as a specialized stem with leaves adapted for reproduction. Not all flowers have the same typical parts. A male flower may consist of only a stamen. Figure 6 portrays the structures present in a complete flower having all characteristic parts. An outer set of green floral leaves called sepals enclose the other parts of the flower until these are nearly mature. Collectively, the sepals comprise the calyx. An inner set of colored or white floral leaves are called petals. An entire set of petals is called the corolla. In many flowers, the petals are showy and may aid in attracting the attention of insects that assist in pollination. One or more sets of stamens are within the flower. Stamens are the male parts of the flower and are composed of pollen-bearing anthers supported by filaments. When the pollen is mature, it is discharged through the ruptured anther wall and is carried by insects or the wind. The mature pollen grain contains the male cells or gametes that fertilize the female gametes. The pistil is the female part of the flower. Pistils consist of an ovule-bearing base, the ovary, supporting an elongated region called the style. The expanded tip of the style is called the stigma. The male pollen grains are deposited on the stigma, and the gametes move down the style to the female gametes contained in the ovule. The ovary becomes the fruit. Some plants are self-fertile and are able to use their own pollen or pollen from another plant of the same type. European type plums, beans, peas, and marigolds are self-fertile, but cherries and apples must be cross-pollinated for normal seed and fruit development to occur. That is, the female egg or gamete must be fertilized by male gametes from another plant of the same species, but of different genetic makeup. In addition, some species have male and female flowers on separate plants. In order to produce fruit, the female plant must have a male plant or a pollinator nearby. Example, hollies and aucuba. A cone can also be considered a specialized stem with leaves adapted for reproductive purposes. However, it does not have the typical flower parts. Ovules and pollen are borne on separate cones, which are quite different in appearance. The conspicuous cones are the ovule-bearing or female cones. The ovules lie on one of the modified leaves, called a cone scale, and are not surrounded by ovary tissue. Pollen is borne on much smaller cones and is carried by the wind to the ovule. Following pollination, the scales of the cone close so that the ovule is protected while the pollen grain germinates and fertilization of the egg cell occurs. This may take as long as a year. When the ovule matures into a seed, the scales open and the seed is released, as from a pine cone. Not all cones are woody. Surprisingly, the ginkgo is a gymnosperm and its fleshy fruit are really cones. Figure 7 on page 21 shows the reproduction of a conifer. Ferns do not have flowers, fruit, or seed, but reproduce from spores. Each spore is only a single cell. The spores germinate to form small plants that are usually quite different from the mature plants. Figure 8 shows fern reproduction. Fruits and seeds. The botanical term fruit refers to the mature ovary and other flower parts associated with it. It may include the receptacle as well as withered remnants of the petal, sepals, stamen, and parts of the pistil. It would also include any seeds contained in the ovary. They are further grouped by other structural characteristics. A seed is a miniature plant in an arrested state of development. Most seeds contain a built-in food supply. Structurally, the seed is a matured ovule, although various parts of the ovary/fruit may be incorporated in the seed coat. Flowering plants naturally perpetuate themselves from the seeds that develop from their flowers. In the nursery industry, we are most often concerned with the flower itself and its color, beauty, and fragrance, rather than the seed or the fruit produced by the ornamental parts, such as an azalea or a marigold. However, more and more small fruit trees and small fruits are being used in backyard gardens and landscaping situations. And in some cases, the fruit itself is attractive and provides just as much visual interest as the flowers. An example is hollies. Thank you for listening to Chapter 2.